Well, to discuss the expectations on the SADC Extraordinary Double Troika Summit, we are now joined by Dewa Mavhinga, who is Human Rights Watch. We also have the Southern Africa Director and International Crisis Group's Southern Africa Senior Consultant, Piers Pigou, who is joining us for this conversation. Piers, let me start off with you. Good evening and welcome to the show. First of all, what do you make of the news that just came in a bit earlier on that President Philippe is saying that the militants have withdrawn?
Well, I mean, this is not unusual in terms of the insurgents' modus operandi of taking towns and then withdrawing in the face of government advances. So, you know, the government may be pushing a victorious narrative here, but in essence, the insurgents have moved back, will be regrouping, and they retain the initiative in terms of when they may launch the next attack. And I think we're hearing a lot of reports about deep levels of insecurity and fear about where the next attacks will go. Towns like Nangadi, the main town in Nangadi district, are virtually deserted of people because there are huge fears of where will the next attack come from, and that reflects a huge intelligence failure, huge deficits in the situation at the moment. It's very uncertain and it's very insecure.
Yeah, speaking about the uncertainty of it, when I heard the news, the first thought that came to mind is that when militants withdraw, where to?
Well, precisely into neighbouring areas. And of course, the government no longer has an eye in the sky in terms of aerial capacity at the moment, or that's been limited with the withdrawal of the Dyke Advisory Group in the last week. We saw them flying their last combat missions on Sunday. There is meant to be an Air Force component in place, and that's very limited. The South African trained pilots who are going to fly helicopter gunships provided by Paramount in this country are not yet flying in terms of missions. There's some Ukrainian piloted helicopters in the sky, but essentially there's a reliance on drone and some satellite imagery, but we're not at all sure how much of that is being shared with the Mozambican authorities at this juncture.
Okay, and Dewa, let me hear from you. What do you make of that news that just came in that the militants have withdrawn?
Well, as Piers has correctly said, the threat remains, and it remains a huge threat. And in fact, the withdrawal of the militants has nothing to do with the capacity of the Mozambican authorities. And this is what is worrisome, because they remain on Mozambican soil within the province of Cabo Delgado. So this withdrawal does not mean there is no security. Civilians remain at risk, insecure, and even the multi-billion natural gas projects are also very much not secured, because the militants are getting stronger and more audacious, and their attacks are becoming much more coordinated. And as Piers has correctly said, it's unclear what their next attack will be, and the Mozambican authorities do not have enough accurate information to be able to tell what exactly is happening on the ground. And this means that, you know, thousands of civilians remain displaced and unable to safely go back to their places in Palma Town and in other districts of Cabo Delgado province.
One of the military commanders, Dewa, actually told Reuters that they are seeing that some of the residents are returning, but they're returning to a situation where it is an area where there is no food supply.
Absolutely. So we have an unfolding humanitarian crisis, and those that are returning have no security. And this is why we're saying that as SADC Double Troika leaders are meeting, they need to focus on the protection of civilians, on guaranteeing security, because, you know, people are on their own, whether they've fled, and those that tried to go into Tanzania and being pushed back have nowhere to run, and there is absolutely no security at the moment. So the main focus is on the protection of civilians and on addressing the pressing humanitarian needs of these people who are under siege from the militants.
Okay, and with that, Piers, comes another conversation, because Dewa speaks about the protection of civilians. But there is a report, I think it was released by Amnesty International, that found that all three sides are to be held accountable for the attacks on civilians?
Well, the Amnesty International report that was released at the beginning of March raises a number of very profound concerns about human rights violations. Let's disaggregate what those allegations are. The primary concerns relate to the violations perpetrated by the insurgents themselves. We've seen, certainly according to the Armed Conflict Location Events Data Project, ACLED, which is producing a weekly report called Cabo Legado, really worth subscribing to for those people who are wanting to watch this thing. They've showed almost 2,000 civilians have been killed in this conflict so far. And we've heard reports of egregious violations in terms of butchering civilians, targeting civil servants and other members of the administration, ruling party, and so forth. The next set of violations relate to government security forces, and we've seen a number of videos produced by Dewa's organization, brought out and exposed by Dewa's organization and by Amnesty International, relating to violations perpetrated by the security forces, violations that are routinely either ignored or allegations routinely ignored or denied by the authorities. And then the third set of allegations were leveled at the Dyke Advisory Group. And these are based on a set of telephonic interviews in which allegations are made that in certain instances the Dyke Advisory Group has indiscriminately fired at civilians. Mm-hmm. Now, they have also denied these allegations and say that they are subject to an internal review. And I think, a number of people are looking at the Dyke Advisory Group and want to have a fuller picture of exactly what they've been involved in. They said that they've been embedded inside the police command structures, that they've had police command, and those are the people that have pointed out their targets for them. So I think there's a lot more that we need to know about the different areas of violations. So we should be careful not to equate three different sides in this equation.
Mm-hmm. So there's that one aspect in terms of the work that's being done by the Dyke Advisory Group, but we can't discount the assistance that they have given the Mozambican government. And then it comes in the question that with the Dyke Advisory Group withdrawing because the contract coming to an end, what void does that then leave in this battle?
Well, there is a void at the moment, and I think most security analysts are saying it was irresponsible of the Mozambican government to not have at least some kind of interim measure in place in order for their own Air Force component to be able to take this over. Now, as I was saying earlier, Paramount, the South African arms manufacturer, has been training Mozambican pilots and equipping Gazelle helicopter gunships. The Mozambican Army Air Force has also recruited in Ukrainian mercenaries to fly large helicopter gunships that will replace DAG. And they seem to not really be fit for purpose in terms of what we've heard so far. So there's a real concern at the moment that there is a void in terms of aerial capacity, but also there's a bigger problem here, is that the aerial armed capacity is not tied to the ground force capacity,
boots on the ground,
and not tied properly. Yeah, absolutely, and not tied to a proper coastal security strategy either. So there's lots of fragmentation in the way that the Mozambican military and security forces are trying to address this thing. And what we've seen so far has not been impressive. And frankly, civilians are going to be facing the brunt of this yet again, as Dewa has been pointing out.
Yeah. And Dewa, then the president speaking earlier on the state broadcaster TVM, saying that those who arrive from abroad will not replace us. They will support us. This is not about pride. It's about sovereignty. And this is an issue that constantly comes up, and I think even President Masisi mentioned the issue around sovereignty. So when this double troika then meets, what should the conversation be about if the president says that they don't come here to replace us, they come here to support us?
Well, I think the Mozambican president, Nyusi, is not being very serious and is not prioritizing the crisis in Cabo Delgado. Sovereignty should not mean that SADC and the African Union should stand back and watch as the region is engulfed in fire. Because if there are no immediate steps to contain this crisis, what it means is that this is a crisis on the doorstep of Zimbabwe, of South Africa, of Malawi, of Tanzania, and it could easily and very quickly engulf the entire Southern Africa region. So that is the main focus, and the Mozambican authorities need to look at it from that point of view. Intervention and support to protect civilians in Cabo Delgado is long overdue. There has been, by the Mozambican authorities, a resort to the use of mercenary groups, but that is not enough, clearly, because now we have that withdrawal, and there is a huge void, and SADC and the African Union have not stepped in. And Mozambique chooses to engage and request for support from the UK, from the US government, from the European Union, but without adequate support from neighbors, that would not succeed. But unfortunately,
Dewa, how should we understand that reluctance to really get full-on support from neighbors? When you have SADC being there, when you have a Troika being there?
Well, there is a link to the root causes of this crisis that we are looking at, and the insurgency, and one of it is massive corruption. You know that Cabo Delgado is home to a multi-billion natural gas project. There are also ruby mines in Cabo Delgado, and also a massive smuggling route for drugs. So perhaps the government, the authorities in Mozambique are to an extent complicit in this massive corruption, and they need to own up, because this is a deliberate frustration of regional efforts to do something to ensure that civilians are protected, but also to secure the entire SADC region.
Okay, Piers, your take on that, considering that Mokgweetsi Masisi said earlier on in Zimbabwe that SADC will respond in a helpful manner to ensure that we assure the integrity and sovereignty of one of our own.
Well, let's be fair to SADC in some respects. I know they're under a lot of pressure for not having acted, but they have been trying in their particular style, quiet diplomacy, it was described in the piece at the beginning, since May last year to get Mozambique to come to the table. And Mozambique has really played them in many ways. And if you look at the trajectory of the attempts by the regional body to get Mozambique to put a strategic roadmap on the table, they have failed. And so we've now reached a point where a calamity is unfolding and they've been forced to act. But SADC is going into this meeting effectively unprepared. There is no plan on the table. And I think we need to temper our expectations about what we will get out of this meeting. The regional leaders will certainly be pushing hard for a detailed explanation as to what is going on, and they're not going to have the wool pulled over their eyes by the notion that there is some kind of normalization strategy in play. They will also want some clarity from Mozambique as to exactly what they're doing. I think the region wants to help. There are issues about capacity in the region as well, and there are other issues about who will underwrite any kind of assistance, because the region is struggling in the face of a COVID epidemic and economic challenges itself, and with their own militaries compromised and incapacitated in many ways. But there is some capacity on a number of fronts, not just militarily, but logistically, and also in terms of humanitarian opportunities for them to step in and to be part of an integrated strategy and plan. But will Mozambique allow that? There's a lot of internal pressure on Nyusi himself, and linking to what Dewa was saying about corrupt and illicit economies, we understand there's a lot of pressure from some very powerful people in Cabo Delgado, who are some of the major players in Frelimo, to actually stop the door from being open to SADC.
Well, and we've also heard from Renamo saying that allow foreign governments to come and assist Mozambique as it currently faces that instability, as well as the growing tension within the northern parts of the country. When we come back, we'll visit that declaration that was made around how to assist Mozambique back in May 2020 and how far we've come so far. That conversation just after this.